Welcome along to this advent calendar tutorial. I'm Faye from Studio Jepson. Let's dive right in, shall we? So opening up our kit, you'll find that you have the dashwood panel, and that's printed with the sections that are going to become your pocket, as well as the section that you're going to stitch your pocket pieces onto. You also have some wadding that's going to give your advent calendar a lovely quilted appearance, and you have your backing fabric in orange, and you also have 4 long thin pieces which are going to become your tab tops. So to get started sewing your advent calendar, you're going to need a basic sewing kit consisting of a sewing machine. You're going to need an iron, some fabric scissors, some pins and some thread. You can see from the pockets that they're made up of various different colours. I will always sew an advent calendar like this in white because there are some white pockets and I've got white handy. By all means, use whichever thread you feel suits this project best. In the past, I have used gold top stitch thread. That looks really nice too. But if you've only got white thread at home, that's still going to look really great with your advent calendar. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to prepare our pieces that are going to become the pockets. Now you can see that this panel has got a pink edge, and around each pocket there's a big white margin. This is going to be your seam allowance that we're going to press down. So what we're going to do is, making sure we're only cutting through this piece, we are going to cut around this big white rectangle. So we're going to, I like to use scissors for this job. If you'd rather use a rotary cutter, by all means do so. So we're just going to cut the pockets out. Can you see that I'm keeping my, I'm working in a light block so it's nice and light for you, but I do have to move my fabric around. But can you see that I'm keeping this bottom part of the scissor in contact with the flat surface or the table beneath it? That's going to ensure that you can make nice, clean, confident strokes with your scissors. So we're going to complete this process for all 5 sets of pockets. So once you've cut your 5 pocket rectangles out, you should have something like this. The next step is we are going to prepare the top of the pocket for stitching. Now, if you want to, this is absolutely only if you want to, and I think I've done this maybe twice out of the 10 that I've made. You can overlock or zigzag neat in the top edge of your pocket before we turn it over. That, in my mind, that's not necessary because you're not going to wear this. It probably isn't ever going to have to go through the wash. I think if you do a nice job of pressing and stitching this in place, that neatening of the back of the pocket top is not necessary. So if you do want to do that, do it now before we press. But let's carry on now. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our iron, and we're going to, can you see I'm just folding this over to where the top of each pocket falls, and I'm going to just press that in place. I'm just going to use a pressing cloth because my iron is not very nice and clean. So just work your way along the pocket. Until you've pressed all of that top seam allowance over towards the back of the pocket. So once you have pressed your turning in place like so, you should have a nice crisp edge to the top of your pocket. We are now going to machine stitch that turning in place. So let's hop over to our machine and stitch the top pocket. So we're going to stitch that top of the pocket in place. Now you can, if you've pressed your pocket edge, you might not even feel like you need to pin this in place. If you want to put a pin in, pop a pin in. I'm actually using a fabric glue pen. This is a temporary, oh, not on my light box. A temporary glue that I use this pen quite a lot for quilting projects. So that's just gonna, can you see, I've just popped a wee bit of glue on the turning. And now I'm going to stitch that in place. So I'm just going to move the needle over on, I'm going to use my 10, get the focus back on. I'm going to use my 10mm guide here, but I'm actually going to move my needle over. I'm going to move my needle over a couple of mil, so there's no chance that I'm not going to catch the top of my, all of my seam allowance, sorry. So can you see I've just moved that over? Let's move it by 2.5. Okay, so I'm lining up with my, I'm lining up with my 10mm guide, and I'm going to stitch, and I'm going to ensure that I reverse at the beginning and the end of my stitches. So you can see my reverse button's already on. Oh, I haven't plugged my foot in. I'm sewing stood up to show you this. It's quite an important part of the process, Faye. Right, okay. What's silly billy? Right, let's go. So just take your time through this bit. You don't want to have more wobbly stitches than are necessary. So there is the top of my pocket stitched. And now it's time to go back onto the iron, where we're going to form the rest of the pockets. So we're going to begin forming the pockets themselves now. These are created by pleating the pockets. So can you see here? Oh, that wasn't very accurate. Let's do that again. We're going to take the outside edge of the pockets and we're going to bring them towards that dotted line. So just check I'm not taking too much like I did last time. Okay, so let's bring that in to the dotted line and press. I'm going to repeat the process with this part of the pocket. Hopefully they've put a line around the white pockets this year. That has not been the case for the last few seasons. Okay, so we press. And then I'd just like to pop a couple of pins in there to keep that in position whilst I do all of the pockets. So we're going to work our way along the strip, creating that pleat. So you can see then you'll be able to get your hand inside the pocket. And then once we have done the pleats, we're going to move on to that bottom edge. So here's that's my first row of pockets all pinned in place, ready to go. And I'm just going to show you what's going to happen if you're struggling to understand how it's going to look. So what's going to happen is when we turn our pieces under and lay it on, you can see that they're going to match up to the corresponding squares on the panel. So only one more bit of pressing to do before we can go to the machine and stitch. And now what we're going to do is use our iron, and we're going to do the same thing to turn this seam allowance underneath the pocket. So we're just going to use the colourful pocket as our guide. Just going to turn that under slightly so it's not at risk of poking out when I come to stitch. Just take care with your fingers, don't accidentally burn your fingers. Same thing at this corner, I'm just going to gently miter it. I find that the better job you do of pressing, the easier the stitching is. So let's work our way all along the pocket until we've turned under all of the seam allowances. Show you in a bit more detail what I'm doing here. Can you see I'm turning these corners under? I'm mitering them like the corners, how you do corners of a present. The reason for that is when I come to sit and stitch at my machine, I know that I'm not going to have any of this seam allowance poking out, because that's where it tends to sort of collect, is in the corners. So just make sure you've got a really nice crisp press on that, and then you can see that that's going to look really lovely and neat and clean when we get it on the panel. So there's our pocket prepared to applique onto our panel. So we're going to get all 5 pocket pieces to that stage, and then we are going to cut out the panel to stitch it onto. So I'm just cutting the actual panel that we're going to stitch our pockets onto. I'm just attaching that from the other side, and now we are ready to apply our pockets. So you will notice that you've got all your pockets are slightly different colours. So just flip that over. Can you see that this pocket panel has got, at the bottom of the panel, has got orange, white, green, cream, orange, same as our pockets. So what we're going to do now is just lay that on top of the pocket. And what you might need to do, what you might need to do is just maneuver it somewhat to make sure that you're sitting on the right colour square. So I find that the allowance that's been given on these panels for you to turn back and form that pleat, I find it's pretty stingy. So I actually find the easiest way to create these pleats is to press all your edges of your pockets. Then can you see there's this dashed line? I find the easiest thing to do is to line the dashed up line with where the 2 colourful squares meet, and then that sort of gives me a bit of room to manoeuvre really, and to place that, to get that in the right place. Oh, my camera's moving. I find otherwise it can be a bit tight and it's a bit tricky, so I find by anchoring that centre line you can get an even distribution to your pocket. I'll just pin that in place. And we'll move over to the other side. And I'll repeat the process here. Just taking care to make sure that none of my seam allowance is poking out. So I'm just working my way along the pocket. And what I'll do is I'll put it in place roughly, and then I'll add more pins. I might even add, another press if I think it's starting to look a bit dragged about and not very crisp. I might just run the iron over it again, taking care not to melt any pin heads. I find as well you start to get into a bit of a flow of it once those first few pins are in. So one more to do. So just make sure that your pockets are lying nice and flat when you've pinned them in place. And now all we're going to do is we're just going to stitch all the way around our pockets in the sort of bottom of the rectangle U shape, and then we're also going to stitch these sections in place to make sure that that pocket's properly secure. We do move on and set on my machine. I just want to show you something very quickly in case any of you are on the fence about whether you should sew this by machine or hand. This, I think I made this 2 years ago, or was it last year? This is I stitched this advent calendar entirely by hand. I've used embroidery floss to attach the pockets, and I think this is one of my favourites. I love how crafted it looks. To me, by sewing it by hand with embroidery floss, it feels more tactile. I love how it feels and looks. So this is an alternative. If you didn't want to do the machine stitching and you wanted to sew it on by hand, that's how great it can look in doing so. Now gang, I want to have a very quick word with you about tacking. If you've never heard that word before, it's also known as basting, and all tacking and basting is a temporary stitch. So it's usually done with a hand sewn needle and a different colour thread, so it's easy to distinguish when you come to remove it. But some machines have tacking stitches too, and all it is a massive stitch to make it easy to remove. Now the reason I want to talk to you about tacking is it's great if you're a beginner. It's also great if you've been sewing years and years and years like me. Okay, so if you haven't stitched anything before, I strongly recommend you take the time. It'll take you 5 minutes. Grab a hand sewn needle and a different colour thread, and just use the tacking stitch to temporarily attach that pocket to your panel. This will mean when you come down to sit at the machine that your pocket is in the correct position on your panel, and all you have to worry about is getting your stitch in a nice position. You're not also battling the pocket placement whilst you sew. Now if you are like me and you've been sewing years and years and you think I don't need to do that, I urge you just to take the 5 minutes to do it, because it really does elevate your finish. And also it's lovely to have that fabric in your hand and have that really tactile experience. So if you can spare those 5 minutes, go grab a cup of tea and a hand sewn needle. Let's tack those pockets in place, and then let's join me at the machine. So I'm just finishing up my tacking here. As I mentioned before, I'm using a green thread because that is easily noticeable for when I come to remove it. I'm just putting these stitches in sufficiently to secure it in place. So you can see they're quite big stitches. That's going to make it nice and easy to remove. Okay, let's have a little word about what we're going to do on our machine now. So I'm going to show you my favourite foot when I come to sew this on. Have I taken it out already? Yes, I have. Okay, this is my favourite foot. Can you see it's got a metal ridge there? This is called an edge joining foot, and why I love this foot so much is it allows you to get a really, really close top stitch, because I can line the edge of this tab up with the edge of my pocket and sew so close to it. Now, if you've got one of these, let's use it. If you haven't got one of these, don't worry, use your regular foot and just move your needle like I showed you before by moving your needle to the right or the left. So I'm just going to raise my foot. So the aim of the game here is going to try and get as close to the edge of the pocket as possible without dropping off the side of it, and that's why I love to tack, because I can really focus on that now. So just take a little moment to just really check that you're happy with your stitch positioning. Okay, so that should be 2 more from the edge. Let's just check. If you get this set up right now before you start stitching, all your pockets are going to be perfect. So, oh, a little word about perfectionism in sewing. Right, I shouldn't have used that word. There is no such thing as perfect. If your stitching's wobbly, if you fall off and come back on, please don't fret. It's an advent calendar. We're going to put chockies in it or little notes or whatever. It's going to be great. So let's just take our time. So I'm just going to drop my needle now. Let's just move my camera a little bit closer. I'm just dropping my needle now to check that I'm happy with where that stitch is looking, and I am. So let's not forget to reverse. That's super important because we're going to have little hands grabbing in this, so let's make sure we reverse. We've got a nice stable stitch. Okay, so we're just going to stitch our pockets on. Now when we come to the, I'm coming to the corner, can you see? I'm just starting to slow down. What I'm going to do is when I'm one stitch depth away, I drop my needle, I lift my foot, I turn. I drop my foot, start sewing again. Now I like to attach all the bottom sewing and then do these sections. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. The reason for that is I find it's nicely secured in place. Sort of the hard work's been done for you by then. So I'm coming to the corner again, as you can see. Drop the needle, raise the foot, turn. Don't forget to reverse it at the end. Okay, let's just make sure we're trimming our threads as we go. Makes it easier at the end. And now we can move on to stitching the center of the pockets. So for this we're gonna keep our needle position exactly where it was before, and all we're gonna do is start at the top, go down in another U shape, and make sure we reverse at the beginning and the end, cut our threads off and move on and do the next one. You can by all means do this all in one go. I just think this is an easier method. I think that it's more secure. Just do that now. Don't forget to reverse. Same process. Come to one stitch away, drop the needle, lift the foot. I'm just going to sew across the bottom. Drop the needle, lift the foot. Make sure that you're keeping all your excess out the way and not underneath your work, or you're going to end up catching everything and sewing it together. And then we just stitch down the other end. Don't forget to reverse. Let's just trim our threads as we go. And there you have the completed pocket. So, hang on, let's remove my tacking so I can actually get my little hand in there. There's your completed pocket. So now we just need to repeat that process all the way through the panel. So once we have attached all 5 rows of our pockets, we are now going to remove any tacking or loose threads from the stitching. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually cut this panel from the big piece of fabric. So what we're going to do is take our scissors and we're going to cut along the blue line. Take care, just take some time with this. We don't want to creep too far onto the blue because that's going to be our seam allowance, and we want to make sure that we have this lovely scalloped edge within our advent calendar. So take your scissors and now cut around the blue line. I'm just taking my unpicker out. If you don't have an unpicker, I'd probably use the head of a pin. Please don't use anything. Please don't use your scissors or anything now to remove this tacking. That means you're liable to gouge your fabric and make a hole. That'll be gutting after you've just done all this work. So carefully go through, remove all your tacking, and trim any loose threads. We're now going to move on to our tab top, so you're going to need your orange rectangles. This is the first advent calendar I ever made. Since then I think I've made about 10. But this is what we're going to end up with here. we're going to use this fabric to make our tabs. Now, the reason you've got 4, not 5, is that you want to have 4 along the top here so that you can slide a wooden dowel in, and you don't want one at the centre, you want them spread out in a 4, not a 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each of our orange pieces and fold them in half, aligning the long edges. So we're going to use our pins. You'll notice I'm pinning in this direction, not this direction where the stitch is going to go, because we can very carefully, not at speed, stitch over the top of these pins if they're at a right angle to the seam. If you're not comfortable with that, you can tack, or you can just remove as you go, that's also fine. So we're going to do all 4 in the exact same way. So to make this type of tab finish here, this is a process known as bagging out. Now when you bag out, you put right sides together, stitch and turn it inside out. Now what you don't want is huge, big, bulky seams. So when you come to do your next bagging out project, you can use a centimetre seam allowance and then trim. I'm erring on the side of caution in case we've got some real beginners with this, and I think it's better not to trim in case you accidentally cut through your seam. Excuse me. So instead what we're going to do, we want a nice wee seam allowance, so we're going to mark 5mm. If you're comfortable changing your seam allowance to 5mm without marking, please go ahead and do so, but I'm going to talk you through, if you're new to sewing, how you can achieve a 5mm seam allowance. So I am using a set square here. You can easily just do this with a ruler and mark 5mm and then connect the line. I am using a friction pen. This will disappear, the pen will disappear under heat. And all I've done is I'm going to mark on 5mm on each of my pieces, and then I'm going to follow that line when I sew. If you haven't got a friction pen at home, you can use a pencil. Oh, this one's going a bit rubbish actually. A moment, let's get a pencil. So you can use a pencil. You're not going to see this. This is going to be trapped on the inside. That doesn't mean I would use a Sharpie or anything too aggressive. So mark all your pieces with a 5mm seam allowance, and then we're going to sit at our machine and stitch. So we're sat back at our machine now, and we have our regular straight stitch on, and we are now going to stitch following that marked 5mm line. Critically important that we reverse at the beginning and the end of our stitch. One thing to mention, I'm sewing on white thread now because I'm still threaded up from white. This will not be visible from the outside, so it's absolutely fine if you don't want to go and thread out with orange. So I'm just carefully following that marked line. So we're going to follow that process for all 4 pieces. So we are now going to begin the process known as bagging out. I've had a lot of beginners sewers are scared to attempt this technique because it's been given a bit of a terrifying rep on Great British Sewing Bee, but actually it's a really nice finish. I most times when I sew, I incorporate some element of bagging out because it looks lovely and clean. You can't see any seams. So what we're going to do, we're going to start by taking our fingers, and we're just going to start to turn this the right way out. Now, please don't be tempted, whilst we're doing this, to poke sharp objects up inside this bagging out tube, okay? It will not end well. It will result in a hole. That being said, a chopstick is a great tool to use to turn this out, as is one of these. This is my favourite sewing tool. This is called a hemostat. I've shown you these on every video I sew with. It's a cross between like a scissor handle and a tweezer, and this is a medical grade tool. So doctors use these, nurses use these, I believe dentists use them, and it's called a hemostat. And what I love about it is now I can just poke this inside and start pulling it through. So however, if you're using just your hands or a chopstick or a tool like this, pull each one of them right side out, and then we're going to head over to the iron. Okay, so we're back at the iron now with our 4 tubes, and what we're going to do is press them so that our seam is at the center, like so. So give them a nice press with the iron on, on a medium heat. So just press all 4 so that that seam is sitting at the center. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fold it in half, aligning these 2 short edges, like so. And then you've got a nice neat tab top with no seam visible. So I have now laid my advent calendar on top of my piece of wooding, and I've taken care to smooth the panel itself out and put plenty of pins in place to make sure that there's no air bubbles excuse me, there's no air bubbles or puckers in the fabric. It's all looking lovely and smooth. So we're now going to attach our orange tabs. When this gets bagged out, the tabs will flip up this way. So what we're going to do is position them with the short ends here in line with the top of the panel itself. So I'm going to line my first one up with the edge of the number 6 pocket. Pop a pin in. And I'm going to put my next one lining up with the edge of the number 4. Need some more pins. I'm just giving you this as a guide. It won't matter if you're slightly in a different place. Oh, that's a terrible pin. And then we're going to space the remaining 2 tabs. We're going to space them out evenly. Just make sure it's nice and correctly in place. Does that look even? Yes, it does look even. Okay, so once these are now pinned in place, what we're going to do is get our hand sewing needle, and we are going to quickly tack all the way around the edge of the panel. That will hold the wadding in place and also hold our tab top pieces in place. Take one final moment to make sure that you've got no air bubbles or puckers in your panel being tacked onto your wadding. If that's all feeling great, let's get our sewing scissors, and now we're going to cut all the way around the edge of the panel. So your panel should be looking a little something like this with your wadding now trimmed down. We are now going to use this panel as a pattern piece to cut our backing panel. So take your last big piece of orange cotton, lay your panel right sides facing down, making sure that you've got your tabs facing inwards. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pin all the way around our panel, and we're going to cut, and our cut line will align with the panel edges. So as we did before, just make sure that you keep smoothing out so that we're not in danger of getting any air bubbles or puckers. You can see I'm not going right up to this edge because that's the selvage, which is the neatened edge of the fabric. So I'm just moving that a couple of centimetres away. So you can see I've started at one edge and I'm going to work my way across, smoothing. I'm also going to put a couple of pins in the middle. I like to do that just to make sure that it's lovely and flat. So once that's all pinned and cut to size, it's going to look a little something like this. We're on to our final part of making the advent calendar now. We're going to stitch this together. So you have two options here. We are going to use a 10mm seam allowance. Now you can either follow the 10mm seam allowance guide that's on your sewing machine, or if you want to revisit the technique we used on the tab tops where we marked our seam allowance on, by all means go ahead and do that now. So we're going to use a 10mm seam allowance. Now the critical part of bagging this out is we need to leave an opening in order to be able to turn the advent calendar through. So at the bottom part of your panel, which is down here, we're going to leave an opening, and I think we want to be leaving an opening for ease roughly 25, I'd say about 25 centimeters. So what I'm going to do is just mark that with some pins. I like to do this, otherwise I like to mark with 2 pins in this way. Otherwise what happens is I get onto the sewing machine, I get in the flow, and I forget to stop. and then I think, oh great, I've got to unpick this. So we are now going to stitch all the way around with a 10mm seam allowance, leaving approximately 25 centimeters as a gap at the bottom. Please don't forget to reverse at the beginning and the end of your stitching. So we've stitched all the way around, and now we have our opening here that we can turn our advent calendar right side out. The first thing we need to do before we can do that though is just trim our corners. So we're just going to snip the edges off our corners, taking care not to go too close to the stitch line. So you can see I've just made a cut there, and I'm just going to make a little gradual sort of fade from where I've just snipped to a few centimeters past that point. And this would mean when we come to turn it right side out, we're going to end up with a nice clean corner here. So repeat that process on all 4 corners, and then we're going to put our hand inside that opening and flip it right side out. So I've turned it right side out. There's our tab tops ready to insert our dowel through, and now you can see at the bottom of the calendar we have this opening. So all we need to do now is push our seam allowance up by 10mm, same on this side. And then we're going to pin this opening in place and hand stitch the bottom. I have pinned the bottom of the advent calendar where we had the opening. It's pinned in place and ready to stitch. So I'm going to, I've got a piece of cotton and hand sew needle. I'm going to knot to the end of my cotton. Just do one knot and then another knot on top of it, and that will secure the beginning of my stitches. So I'm now going to hand sew this closed. So I put the first stitch in, and then what I'm going to do is making sure I'm catching both sides of the seam. Put my needle back through, and then I'm going to poke my needle through this loop. That's made that nice and secure. So I'm just going to work my way along the bottom of the advent calendar. So as we come to the end, to secure our stitches, we're going to put the needle through the same place, find the loop and stitch through it, needle in the same place, find the loop, stitch through it and trim. So all that's left to do now is trim off any loose threads, give it a final press and insert the dowel through the top of the advent calendar.